Well, we live in an age of self-improvements. I think you'd all agree. We live in this age of self-improvement today. And, everywhere we turn, somebody's, telling us how to become better versions of ourselves. Read a book, listen to a podcast, build these habits, improve your health, grow your career, maximize your potential. And so we oftentimes then will approach the church with questions like, what am I going to get out of today's message? What am I going to get out of today's worship? Or am I growing spiritually? And those aren't bad questions to ask from time to time. But when we only ask those questions, we can turn the church into this place of self-improvement. But let me tell you something. I'm going to put a truth up on the screen. God isn't simply interested in building up you. He's committed to building up his church. Now, when we move from this place of self-improvement to spiritual investment, what we actually discover is that that's when our greatest growth happens. And so we're in the middle of this series right now. For those of you who don't know, we're in the middle of a series titled We is Greater Than Me. And it's called The Equation for an Uncommon Church. And each message is focused on moving from a place to a new place. And so the places that we're moving from are the equations for a common church. We want to move to the places that are equation for an uncommon church. And so we started this series by talking about how God has moved us from this place of individualism into community. And that's what sin does. Sin isolates us. Sin separates us. It makes us individuals. God has invited us back into community with him. This is all by grace. Well, then we started talking about moving from consumers to contributors. And last week, we talked about moving from my agenda to our mission. Today, we're talking about moving from self-improvement to spiritual investment. And this is really important. And we're actually reading from a letter called 1 Corinthians. And it's called 1 Corinthians because it's the first letter that a man named Paul wrote to a group of Christians who lived in this ancient city called Corinth. Now, the man named Paul who wrote the letter, he committed his life to Jesus and he committed to telling people about Jesus, and he would travel all over the world to start churches, and the churches would kind of get started, and then he'd go, he would go start another church and he'd go to the next town. Well, one of the churches he started was in this city of Corinth, and the Christians in Corinth, Paul leaves, they have some questions. And so they write a letter to Paul. Paul then gets their letter, he answers their questions, and he writes a letter back to them. That's what we're reading when we read the book of 1 Corinthians. We're eavesdropping on this ancient conversation. Now, the conversation was about their focus. Now, most of them were focused on building up themselves. And Paul's going to challenge them by saying, guys, look, the church is more than that. I want you to become someone who builds up yourself, right? I want you to be strong, but I also want you to be someone who builds up the church. And so Paul launches right into it, and so are we. He says, pursue love and earnestly desire the spiritual gifts, especially that you may prophesy. For one who speaks in a tongue speaks not to men, but to God. For no one understands him, but he utters mysteries in the spirit. On the other hand, the one who prophesies speaks to people for their upbuilding and encouragement and consolation. The one who speaks in a tongue builds up himself, but the one who prophesies builds up the church. And so we're going to pause right here for just a moment, because what Paul just said right now is the key to understanding everything that's going on here. But oftentimes we overlook the main point of this because we want to talk about things like tongues and prophecy. And so we skip right over the whole point of what Paul wants to teach us. And what you need to know right now is that those things called tongues and prophecy, they are secondary to the main point that Paul is making. The main point that Paul wants to make is this contrast between two things. Number one, building up yourself, and number two, building up the church. That's the point of the whole passage. And Paul continues. He says, the one who speaks in a tongue builds up himself, but the one who prophesies builds up the church. Now, I want you all to speak in tongues, but even more to prophesy. The one who prophesies is greater than the one who speaks in tongues unless someone interprets, so that the church may be built up. All right, so I just told you the key to understanding this entire passage is to recognize the contrast between building up oneself and building up the church. That's the key to understanding what Paul is saying here. Now, to make this point, Paul points out two things, tongues and prophecy. And so let's ask the question, what are tongues and prophecy? Well, let's start with prophecy. What is prophecy? Well, a helpful thing to think about when you're trying to understand prophecy is to distinguish between pointing out what's happening before our very eyes and number two, predicting the future. Those are two really important distinctions to think about. Now, everyone assumes that prophecy means predicting the future. And it can mean that. Sometimes that's true. But most of the time, when you read the prophets of the Bible, most of what those guys are saying are things like, man, you're trampling the poor. I mean, you don't care about, the poor in your communities. Like, you're completely overlooking these things. You're robbing them. You're trampling the crippled. There's no justice. You see, prophets typically point out what's happening before our very eyes. And that's most of what prophecy is about. Everyone assumes that prophecy is all about predicting the future, but actually prophets, they tend to see things very clearly. And maybe you've been around someone who's very opinionated. Hopefully my wife doesn't look at me right now. Or maybe you've been around someone who's very opinionated and they can tell instantly whether someone is right or whether something is right or wrong. That's a prophet. Prophets see things very clearly. Or maybe you've said something like, this country is going to you know what, and here's why. That's prophecy. Like, you're being a prophet if you've ever said that, because you're pointing out what's happening before our very eyes. Now the question is, what's the point of pointing out what's happening before our very eyes? Is it just to call out the problems in our culture, to be critical? And the answer is no. Prophecy is not criticism. It's corrective. Prophecy is not criticism, it's corrective. Here's an example of what prophecy in the Old Testament looked like. It comes from the Old Testament prophet Amos. This is what he said. Amos prophesied by saying this publicly. He says, "You sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. You trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth and turn aside the way of the afflicted." And notice that Amos isn't talking about some far-off future event. He's talking about what's happening right now in the life of Israel. He says, you guys are selling good people for a pair of shoes. What? You guys turn away people who need help. Like, come on, are you serious? But he doesn't just criticize them, he actually corrects them. Now look at what he says next. He says, seek good and not evil, that you may live. And so the Lord, the God of hosts will be with you. Seek good and not evil. In other words, here's what's wrong and here's how to fix it. And so prophecy is important because it points out what's wrong, it corrects it, and then it builds up. And that's what prophecy is all about. So all of you who are all into the revelation stuff, get out of that. That's not prophecy. Prophecy is pointing out what's happening in our very eyes before us. And so let's talk about tongues for just a moment. Ask this question. And I'm sure some of you have heard about tongues. We've kind of stepped into a minefield here. The Greek word is actually glossolalia, and that means language. And so tongue is a slang term for the term or the concept of language. And so let me put a definition of language up on the screen for you. Language is a system of sounds, letters, and words that we use to communicate with one another. All of you know that. We don't even think about it, but we use language all day, every day. And language is this gift from God. It gives us the ability to share what's going on inside of us with others. I mean, language is a beautiful thing. Now, something that's true of language is that language is intelligible. I think we'd all agree about that, right? Like, language is intelligible. That means language is understood by people, maybe not all people, but at least some people. And for instance, Erica is fluent in German. If Erica started speaking German right now, I wouldn't have a clue about what you're saying, Erica, but there are some people who would because they can speak that language. Now, the point I'm making, what you need to know is what you need to understand about tongues is you've probably heard or seen Christians speaking gibberish, which they say is the gift of tongues, the gift of languages. Now, I'll tell you that I'm very skeptical of people who do those things. I'm very skeptical that what they're doing is what the Bible actually describes for us. And here's why. Language is intelligible. Language is intelligible because it comes from an intelligible God. The living God that we worship, he's not schizophrenic. That's not who he is. When he speaks, there's meaning, there's intelligibility, there's purpose, there's intentionality to his words. And he speaks to us in ways that we can understand. Now, that unintelligible gibberish, which is what you see on social media, is actually more of a reflection of the Greek and Roman gods. The Greek and Roman gods that you can read about, I mean, they were totally unpredictable. And you can read about them from, Greek and Roman authors, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. I mean, these guys would describe the Greek and Roman gods. I mean, they were totally schizophrenic. You had no idea what they were going to do from one moment to the next. And so the idea that there's this gift of language that has no intelligible meaning to anyone, it's kind of like this gibberish, and that somehow that's a reflection of the intelligible God whom we worship. I think, what did George Strait say? If you'll buy that, I've got some oceanfront property in Arizona. I mean, I don't think so, George. I'm not buying it. I'm not buying it. And laying aside all of that, though, we can ask the better question, what was the purpose of tongues? Well, look at what Paul says in verse 2. For one who speaks in a tongue speaks not to men, but to God. For no one understands him, but he utters mysteries in the Spirit. You see, the purpose of the gift of languages is to speak privately to God in prayer. And what does Jesus say about prayer? He says, close the door. And listen to what Jesus says. When you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they've received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room, shut the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And when you pray, listen to this, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do. That's another word for Greeks and Romans. For they think that they will be heard for their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. And so let's put these two things together. Jesus says when you pray to God, close the door, pray in private. And Paul says the gift of languages is this gift to speak privately to God in prayer. It's between you and him. I'll tell you what I believe is going on here with this gift of tongues, this gift of languages, is that when you pray privately to God, his Holy Spirit meets you there and prays alongside of you. And that's a beautiful thing, building you up. You're speaking privately to God in prayer. That's a wonderful thing. And we can ask that same question to prophecy. What's the point of prophecy? Well, the answer is in verse 3. Paul says this, on the other hand, the one who prophesies speaks to people for their upbuilding and encouragement and consolation. So the purpose of prophecy is to speak publicly to the church so that the church is built up. Now, I'll ask you the question, but I hope it's clear by now. I hope you can see this contrast that's going on here in this really thorny passage of the Bible that people get tripped up on. The contrast is between this idea of building up yourself and building up the church. And so let's listen to it again. Paul says, the one who speaks in a tongue builds up himself, but the one who prophesies builds up the church. Now, brothers, if I come to you speaking in tongues, how will I benefit you unless I bring you some revelation or knowledge or prophecy or teaching? If even lifeless instruments such as the flute or the harp do not give distinct notes, how will anyone know what is played? And if the bugle gives an indistinct sound, who will get ready for battle? So with yourselves, if with your tongue you utter speech that is not intelligible, how will anyone know what is said? For you will be speaking into the air. Now, there are doubtless many different languages in the world, and none is without meaning. But if I do not know the meaning of the language, I will be a foreigner to the speaker, and the speaker a foreigner to me. So with yourselves, since you're eager for manifestations of the Spirit, strive to excel in building up the church. And so again, the main point is this contrast between building up yourself and building up the church. The problem was that there were these individual believers in Corinth who focused only on building up himself or only on building up herself. And that's not necessarily wrong. Like there's a time and a place for personal reflection and growth and development that you need to do at home. Like you need to read the Bible by yourself. You need to pray by yourself. You need to fast by yourself. You need to be doing those things. The problem was that in Corinth, they only focused on building up himself or herself. And they thought, well, I guess this is church. Like I just come in here, I focus on me, myself, and I, my problems, and I leave here a better person. Meanwhile, the person in front of them, the person beside them, the person behind them wasn't being built up. The person they worship with wasn't being built up. And so Paul keeps going and he says, look, here's how you fix this. He gives the church a principle. He asks the question, what's a principle? Well, think of a principle like a starting point. Start here and everything else will take care of itself. Paul says this to the Corinthians. He says, let all things be done for building up. And why is this such an important starting point? It sounds good and everybody agrees that it sounds good, but why does it make sense? Well, here's why. Because we've been called into a community by a holy community. By a God who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He's a holy Trinity. The persons of the Trinity are always and forever working together. And so the issue that the Bible alerts us to this morning is the difference between building up oneself to the neglect of building up the church, the community. You know, self-improvement's not bad. It's not wrong. You as an individual Christian should be growing. You should be doing things on your own, reading the Bible, praying and fasting. The problem, though, is that when you think the church is simply about your self-improvement, that's when it becomes problematic. The church is not simply about your self-improvement. The church is about everyone here being built up together. And here's why this matters. I'll have you think about this chain for just a moment. Now, this is a pretty strong chain, and each of these individual links are strong. You can think of yourself as an individual link in this chain. Now, we all go our separate ways, and we want to make ourselves into the strongest links possible. And that's not necessarily bad. But when you only focus on making yourself a strong link and you don't have any concern for the other links in this chain, you can be the strongest chain link in the world. But your purpose depends on the strength of the link that is ahead of you. Again, you can become the strongest link in the world, but if this link ahead of you is brittle, you're going to break off of this chain and you're going to fall to the ground. And what do you do with a link that is laying on the ground? You pick it up, you throw it away. Like it's completely lost its purpose. You know, this is why it's so important for us to understand moving from this place of self-improvement to a place of spiritual investment. You know, just as the links in this chain need one another to live out their purpose, you need others to live out your God-intended purpose. And that is the absolute truth. You need others to live out your God-intended purpose. Why, you say? Well, because that's the way we've been made. We have been made by a holy Trinity, a community of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That means we were made for community. And so we need one another. And we've been invited into this community with Him and one another by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. And our purpose is to reflect this image of this perfect community that exists in the Godhead to the rest of the world. And so we is forever and always will be greater than me. And this is Paul's point. Like the Christians in Corinth, they were overly focused on self-improvement. Me, myself, and I. I'm going to spend all my time trying to make myself the strongest link the world's ever seen. And Paul's like, wait a minute. Like, wait a minute, guys. You're not wrong for wanting to become a stronger Christian. But what about the person in front of you? What about the person behind you? What about the person beside you? You need them as well to live out your purpose. And so you've got to be concerned about them. Guys, don't have this thin view of the church, Paul says. You know, don't have a thin view of the church. The church is not simply about your self-improvement. It's about us growing together into a community. Paul says the church is about everyone being built up. And that's the goal, right? Let all things be done for building up the church, Paul says. And when you start here, you're going to live out your purpose. You're going to discover your God-intended purpose in this world. And this is Paul's message. Again, we is forever and always greater than me. And so I want to make a transition in this message. And I want to ask the question, how do we relate some of these problems to our situation today? And before I do that, I want to say just a quick word about serving the church. I don't know what you've heard about serving the church. I don't know what your experiences are like serving in a church. And maybe this is a new thought for some of you. You're like, what? Like serving in a church? That's a completely new idea for me. I'm not telling you to serve the church because I want to have some great organizational model. Okay, I promise you. Like, I'm telling you to serve in the church because that's the only way we're going to grow. And I'll say it to you a little bit more plainly. I need you to grow spiritually because I am only one link in this chain. And you need me to grow spiritually because you are only one link in this chain. We need one another to grow spiritually because that's how God has designed it. You know, He's created us for community. So we need one another. Our growth depends on the strength of one another. And so we is forever and always greater than me. And the way in which Paul drove home this point was through the problem of tongues and prophecy. Tongues was about speaking privately to God to build up you as an individual, whereas prophecy was about speaking publicly to the church so that the church might be built up. And so let's bring these ideas into our world, into our vocabulary. And the reason why we need to do this is not because we have different ideas than they had in the ancient world. No, we have the same ideas. We just use different concepts. We use different words. And so we need to find ways to express those same ideas. And so instead of just talking about tongues, let's rename it to something like this: speaking privately to God, because that's what it amounts to. You know, tongues is speaking privately to God. Whatever you want to believe about the gift of tongues, it's a private conversation between you and God. You're speaking privately to God, and this is something that all of us should be doing on a regular basis. And instead of talking about prophecy, let's rename prophecy to something like this: speaking publicly to the church. Because that's what it amounts to. I mean, that's what prophecy is. It's speaking publicly to the church. And this is something that all of us should be doing on a regular basis. And I know some of you think like, wait a minute, you tell me that I need to preach on Sunday mornings? Well, not quite. You know, the Christians at Corinth, they became overly focused on speaking privately to God, and they forgot to speak publicly to the church. And so the problem was that the person next to them, in front of them, and beside them wasn't being built up. Well, we have the same problems today. I bet that most of you, maybe even all of you, have no trouble speaking to God privately in prayer. You may not have these long-winded prayer times and long-winded conversations, but you'll speak privately to God from time to time. And I bet also that most of you have a hard time speaking publicly to the church. Anybody want to agree with me? Tell me you're with me. Shaking your heads. Okay. Yeah, I bet most of us do, right? All right, let's go one step further. We become overly focused on speaking privately to God. We forget to speak publicly to the church about what God is doing in our lives. And so what ends up happening? Well, the same thing that happened in Corinth. No one is built up. No one is built up in the church. The person next to you is not being built up, and no one ends up growing. Now, the question is, why is this happening? Well, it happened in Corinth because they were a little bit selfish. And I don't think that's our problem. I don't think we have selfish people in this church. Remember, Paul gave them a principle to start from. He said, let all things be done for building up the church. And that was their starting point. Our problem is that we have a different principle, a different starting point. Here's the principle that we live by in our culture. Keep your faith to yourself. Anybody convicted by that? Most of us. And that's true. Like, that's what we've learned. Our culture has taught us that. Keep your faith to yourself. You know, this is the religious principle of our culture. Guaranteed. This is what our culture builds religion on. Keep it to yourself. No one else wants to hear it. Don't you dare speak publicly about your faith. It's just for you and you only. It's private. No one else wants to hear it. This is why it feels completely unnatural for us to speak publicly to the church about what God is doing in our lives. This is a problem. Now, we're all familiar with this problem, but let me illustrate it for you so that we're all on the same page. Each of us walks into a Sunday service, Sunday worship service with a smile on our face. Life's great. Everything's wonderful. Hey, man, how you doing? Oh, I'm great, man. How was your week? Oh, it was great. We had an awesome week. It was fantastic. And because you start with the principle, keep your faith to yourself, no one has the courage to say what's really on their mind. You know what? It wasn't a great week. I had anxiety all week. My marriage isn't great right now. I'm drinking too much alcohol. I'm starting to have thoughts that are coming from a dark place, and I'm not too sure what to do with those thoughts. This is a problem. The problem goes even deeper than that. You see the person in front of you, the person behind you, the person beside you, who's dealing with the exact same thing as you. But because you don't want to say anything, he won't say anything. And so what ends up happening? Neither of you are built up. This is a problem. We've made it this far, so we might as well just go down to the bottom. This is why people outside the church struggle with the church. Because when they look inside, they see what we show them, a bunch of perfect people who have their lives together in perfect order. But they're so far from that. And so they feel uninvited. They feel like this whole church thing is just completely unapproachable for any of them. But then we fall. They see that, and they call us hypocrites. And what's the result of all of this? No one is built up. No one is built up. This is a problem. I just painted this really bleak picture that we all know is true, and it's true of so many churches. And what causes this? Well, the answer is really simple. The one who speaks in a tongue builds up himself, but the one who prophesies builds up the church. When the members of the church stop talking publicly to the church is not built up. Guarantee it. When the members of the church stop talking publicly to the church, and a lot of us think that Satan is just this belligerent liar who will say the pen is blue when the pen is really red. Like, a lot of us think that his lies are really easy to spot, but it's actually the complete opposite. The Bible says he is cunning. That means sometimes deception is so hard for us to pick up on. And it can be hard to pick up on his deception because his deception is always based on truth and goodness. Like, it's always based on truth and goodness. He'll take something that's good and true, and then he'll twist it. For instance, he'll take something like self-improvement, reading your Bible, praying and fasting, and he'll twist that to make self-improvement your entire focus. And you'll end up neglecting to build up the church, the community that you've been called to be a part of, to build up everyone in this church. And we don't want to fall victim to his lies. And so how do we make sure that doesn't happen to us? How do we move from this place of only being focused on self-improvement to this place of spiritual investment? Well, what we need is a better starting point. This is our starting point. Your faith is meant to be shared. And truly, your faith is meant to be shared. People should know you're a Christian because you talk about what God is doing in your life. There's a time and a place for self-improvement. Remember that. I'm not saying that self-improvement's bad. The Bible isn't saying that. There's a time and a place for that. Reading the Bible, praying and fasting are things that should be a part of a regular pattern, the regular rhythms of your life. They're important to your growth and development as a Christian. But remember, the church is not about self-improvement. It's about building up everyone in this room. We're all individual links in a chain. And when those chain links join together, they find their shared purpose. The same thing is true of us. We have a shared purpose. When God calls us into the church, we have a shared purpose. And so because of that, we need to make sure that each individual link is strong and is built up. And so how do we do that? Well, we build up others by speaking to one another. And what does that mean? Well, it means be open. Be honest. Be transparent. Be real with one another. Here's what this looks like. It might be as simple as saying, my wife and I worked through infidelity about 20 years ago. Being open, being honest about that. It might look like this, is saying, I know the pain that comes along with divorce because I've experienced it. You have no idea how beneficial that will be to the community in this room, because you have no idea that people in this room might be going through the exact same thing as you. They might be going through marital infidelity. They might be contemplating divorce. Your wisdom, what you have learned, can help transform their lives. That's how the church is built up. That's how we build up one another. When you speak to one another about what's really going on in your lives, you're investing spiritually in the members of the church. And here's what I've learned over the years. God is intentional, He is purposeful, and He will bring people into your life on either end. On the one end are going to be people who are going to build into your life. On the other end are going to be people whose life you need to be building into. This is how God works. And the more you speak publicly about what you're going through, I can guarantee you that the challenges and the struggles that you're going through are the same challenges and struggles that people in this room are going through. This is what God does. God brings people into our lives who are going through the exact same thing. And the more you speak publicly about those things, about what's going on in your life, God is going to build up the church more and more. And when you invest spiritually in the members of the church, that's how it's built up. That's how it grows. And so I want to close this message with a powerful video of someone from our church doing just that. She's sharing her story and her testimony publicly because she once believed that she wasn't good enough to be invited into the church. And she believed that all the mistakes in her past were preventing her from coming to Christ. And then someone invited her and reminded her that no, you can come to be a part of the community that Christ is forming. And now she's telling her story so that others who feel the same way might come and experience the community that Christ has formed. And so let's put this up on the screen.
One thing that I say would be truly broken was my heart. I had to accept not only the loss of a sibling, but the emptiness of a father figure. That's just what life was from 11 to 18. I did anything, I dated anybody, crazy, we go partying, we go drifting, whatever I could find, whoever I could find that would give me those things, that's what I would say I was chasing. Just to have peace in a hole that I thought was being filled through all those things. I had one friend at 18 ask me if I would come to youth group. I looked at my friend and said, I'm telling you right now, we're gonna step in this church and I'll see you in the afterlife because I'm burning up. It's happening. Because there's no way all these things I did weren't gonna show the minute I stepped into this church.
Yeah, if you've never been baptized, then you need to be baptized on August 28th, and this is your invitation to do so. And I want you to see me after the service to talk about the details, because baptism is the starting point of your new life in Christ. The church was never meant to be this collection of individuals pursuing personal spiritual success. That's not what the church is about. It's a community of people who are working together to build up one another. And so I want to encourage you this week, pursue Christ privately. Do that in your own life this week. Read the Bible, pray, fast, do all the things that you need to do to grow spiritually in your own life, but don't stop there. Invest your life into someone else. Share your story. Speak words of encouragement. This is how you're going to build into the life of others. Be honest about the struggles in your life that you're going through. Build up that person that's in front of you, that's behind you, that's beside you. And that's how God designed His church to flourish. And when every link in the chain is strengthening the next link, everyone grows and the church reflects the image of the God who has called us into community. And so lastly, I'll say it again, we is forever and always greater than me.